Hi, this is Michael Sharkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be in my mind. Now, strangely enough, one of the things that is often on my mind is actually the British military, which I guess sounds odd, but whatever. But it's something actually I put a lot of thought into. I've written about in the past, and this summer in July, I was privileged to participate in RUSI's Land Warfare Conference held in London, RUSI being the preeminent UK think tank, I guess, defense related think tank. I happen to be an associate fellow of RUSI, which is something I'm really quite proud of. Because this topic is so large, I'm actually going to divide it into two separate videos. The first video is going to be about the British military in general and the different challenges that it faces in trying to chart its way forward. The second video is going to focus more narrowly on the British Army. In this video, I'm going to talk then again very broadly about the British military and the dilemmas that it faces. And I'm also hoping one of my objectives here is to try to communicate why this is actually such an interesting topic. This is actually something that fascinates me. And hopefully by the time we're done with this video, you're actually going to agree with me and think, yeah, that's actually a really interesting thing there, Michael. Thank you very much for explaining this all to me. But we'll see. At any rate, there's several reasons to be interested in the British military. One thing is that as a stalwart believer in what I call very frankly, the Pax Americana, it's very important to have a good appreciation for the state of affairs in America's most important security allies, which generally speaking are Britain and France. It's very important that our allies be strong, prosperous, and that they have very strong militaries, and that we can, sort of rely on them to help. Or obviously they want to be able to rely on us. So this is not a one-sided thing. So that's reason enough. The other reason I think is that the British are in the position of having very large ambitions while having very, very limited resources. And they therefore, as a result, they have to make very difficult decisions. So they have to think very clearly about what is the difference between things they need to have versus things that they'd like to have. Also, they need to be able to prioritize of all the things that they need to be able to do or want to be able to do, which comes first in the list of priorities, because they can't do everything. Now, this makes them very different from Americans. Americans, despite the moaning and groaning for the American defense establishment, and I know I have a lot of friends who will write on social media about how we need to boost defense spending. I don't really know about that, but I do know that by and large, frankly, the American defense establishment has virtually unlimited funds. And so the result is that if you approach the U.S. military and say, okay, you have to choose between capability A, B, or C, which will it be? The American military will answer yes. So they try to basically have it all, to have their cake and eat it too, and have all the capabilities and everything that they want. And they don't really spend too much time fretting about the difference between sort of the need to have versus the nice to have. For them, the nice to have is need to have. They don't really distinguish between the two, and they don't have to make very difficult decisions. And arguably, they can get away with this, again, because they have virtually unlimited resources. With Britain, it's just not the case. They have to think very clearly. They have to make very difficult decisions. To be honest, I don't think the British have made good choices since the end of the Cold War. This isn't a criticism. This is more just sort of an observation. And the reality is that these choices that they have to make are really very difficult. So I empathize. And my purpose here is not to criticize, but rather to explain. To explain sort of to whoever's watching this, like, why is this so hard? And what are these difficult choices that they have to make? Because these choices ultimately are about strategy. They're ultimately about defense policy. They're about what kind of military do you need? What for? Why do you even need a military? And what do you need the military for? And what are you hoping to accomplish with your military? What purpose does it serve? All of these, the answers to all these questions thus inform choices about things like what kind of weapons do you have, what kind of force structure do you have, do you give your money to the Navy, do you give your money to the Army, in what proportions, etc. These things are all very difficult, and thus I kind of get it that the British government has really struggled from one government to the next, and now you've got a new government in London, and once again there's going to be yet another strategic defense review, and yet another attempt to try to figure this all out. I'm not sure that they're going to, and I sort of expect that the new strategic defense review is going to be as kind of indecisive as all the previous ones, but we'll see. Maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised. So let's talk about it then. What exactly are the things that the British have, or rather, what exactly are the choices that the British need to make? And I think one way to think about this is in terms of their ambitions. What are their ambitions? I wanted to first say what are their priorities, but the reality is at first you have to come up with a list of ambitions. The things that Britain, I know, for better or for worse, right or wrong, aspires to be able to do. And then once you've kind of laid them out, then you can sort of look at them and figure out, well, where are the priorities? So please forgive me. Generally, I hate PowerPoint, but I found it useful for our purposes to sort of try to put these things on slides to try to explain it. Um, I know that there are people on YouTube videos who've got these really cool slides that they do with even animation. I've yet to learn how to do that. Maybe eventually I will, or somebody will explain to me how to do that. Now I'm just basically cutting and pasting. So here we go. So let's look at this. So we've got British defense ambitions, and they are the following. First of all, there's nuclear deterrence. For Britain, this is sort of like a non-negotiable. Secondly, you have modernization. You have to phase out old stuff. You have to bring in new stuff. Technology changes, things change. So having older things becomes a liability. Plus, older things are more difficult to maintain. They're more fragile. There are all sorts of reasons to get new stuff. Even if it's not necessarily more sophisticated stuff, although that tends to be what happens, but just you need new stuff. Then also Britain aspires to have a global presence, and they also aspire to be able to project force. Force projection, as it's called, is something different from simply having an army that can sit someplace. So, for example, once upon a time, Britain maintained what was called the British Army on the Rhine, that was this very large, very capable military force that sat in Germany. And this was not really a force that you could project, but its job wasn't to be projected somewhere. Projection means, well, I'm going to I'll go into that in further detail, but it's basically sending troops, ideally rapidly, any place in the world, or at least someplace far away, far from your own borders. Also, Britain aspires to be able to tend to European defense, to secure Europe, which, as I'll discuss later, is not quite the same thing as having global presence or force projection. Britain also hopes to be able to contribute meaningfully to a large coalition war alongside the Americans, the French, the Germans, etc. How one does that, the best way to do that, the optimal way to do that is debatable. We'll talk about that. Britain also understands or believes that it needs to be able to deal with anything, anywhere, because you never really know, right? It's very hard to predict when the next war is going to be, where the next war is going to be. Nobody predicted in 2003 that Britain would be fighting a war in Iraq. Nobody was able to predict that Britain would be fighting a war in Afghanistan. But there you are. Where's the next war? It's really hard to say. Thus, you need a force that's flexible. You need sort of a jack of all trades kind of force. The other thing that Britain aspires to do is to develop its industrial capacity. Again, I'll talk about this in more detail later, but it's very important. You need defense capacity, not just to make stuff, but to sustain stuff, to sustain the forces that you have, given the fact that they're going to lose stuff through attrition, through this, through that, wear and tear, but you need defense industrial capacity. So I want to break all this stuff down. So first of all, nuclear deterrence. What is that? Nuclear deterrence basically for Britain means having ballistic missile submarines and the supporting assets. And what I mean by that is, okay, you need to have a certain number of submarines capable of firing missiles. So you also need the missiles and the warheads. But you also need infrastructure to support the submarines, to keep them operable, to refuel them. You also need various assets in order to keep these things safe. So, for instance, you need anti-mine and anti-submarine capabilities to make sure that the enemy isn't going to ambush them as soon as the submarines leave the bases. The submarines have to be able to leave the sub-bases and hit and go into the high seas, for example. So again, it's not just a question of having submarines. It's really just the start of it. The next item that you're going to need is modernization. So modernization, which unfortunately, by the way, all these things are frightfully expensive, and that's really very important here. Modernization means that you have to replace old kit with new kit. In Britain's case, you have to make up for lost years. So think about it this way. I'm a homeowner, and I know that every once in a while I'm going to have to replace the roof. I'm going to have to replace the HVAC system or repair it. I'm going to have to replace the water boiler, the heater, all these sorts of things, all of which is very expensive. Ideally, one does this sort of in a regular schedule. And the thing that one really wants to avoid is having to do multiple repairs at the same time. Like, what if I need to fix the roof while I have to replace the HVAC and replace the boiler? I can't afford to do all these things at once. The temptation always is to defer these expenses, to defer putting on a new roof, to defer getting a new boiler, But the more you defer it, the greater danger there is that these things are going to collapse or there'll be something more catastrophic, or simply the greater the danger that I'm going to have to do more than one of these things at the same time. With weapons, of course, there's the problem that obsolete weapons can be outclassed by new weapons. So I never want to be in the position of going into battle with obsolete weapons that will make it easier for my adversary to defeat me. That's a serious problem. Global presence force projection. What does that mean? What does that require? Well, it requires what's called in the trade expeditionary capabilities. This means you need troops and soldiers and equipment that you can deploy relatively easily. These tend to be lighter than things that you're going to, like, let's say, park in Germany waiting for the Soviets to invade. You also need airlift, you need sea lift, you're going to need ships to protect the sea lift, that kind of thing. So these are expensive. It's an expensive ability to be able to have. The United States, because it's super rich, has a gigantic fleet of airlift ships, airlift capabilities, C-17s, C-130s. It's got all sorts of fancy ships that you can use to send tanks to places far away, and it's expensive. We also have like airborne capabilities. Like we've got like the 82nd Airborne Division. I once watched an exercise where, first of all, you had like all these C-17s lined up, and then these hundreds of troops. They went and they did this airdrop. This was at Fort Bragg. They changed the name to, what is it, Fort Liberty. And I actually watched this exercise alongside a French officer, and the French officer was like in awe of all the C-17s. Like he said to me, "This is power. This is military power." It's true. It's really expensive to maintain that ability. But that's what's meant by having force projection. Force projection also involves things like aircraft carriers. Britain recently acquired two spiffy new aircraft carriers, the Queen Elizabeth class. Aircraft carriers are expensive. You have to man them, you have to equip them, you have to get airplanes to launch off of the aircraft carriers, but you also have to have supporting assets. You need to have ships and subs that will protect the aircraft carrier. So it's a big thing. It's a really big, very expensive capability. There's also what's called long range strike. This comes in the form of aircraft. It comes in the form of missiles that you can launch from the aircraft, or missiles that you can launch from ships, or missiles that you can launch from the ground. These are things that you can fire and it'll hit a target several hundred, maybe several even thousand kilometers away. This is a very important element of force projection. Let's say it's the ability to send frigates to the Eastern Mediterranean, and that those are going to fire tomahawks at targets somewhere, in Syria or Iraq or something like that. That's force projection. Next thing we have is European defense. Now, in previous strategic defense reviews, there's this obvious kind of hemming and hawing amongst British defense policy people about, global interests, European interests is our first mission, NATO is our first mission, I don't know what, maybe we should care more about the Indo-Pacific, etc. I think that the Ukraine war has brought a little bit more clarity to this. I think that European defense and NATO is a higher priority than it had been in the past. There's going to be, I'm expecting to see less temptation, less flirtation with the Indo-Pacific in the next security defense review. Who knows? But also, if you're thinking about European defense, this means you're thinking about fighting the Russians. And we've learned, all of us, a lot about what it takes to fight the Russians from watching the Ukraine war. Among other things, it's made clear that you need mass numbers, which the British don't have, or very few Western militaries, except for arguably the United States has. You also have to fill various capability gaps. Some of these capability gaps are old capabilities that the British used to have during the Cold War, but have disinvested from, like a lot of other Western militaries. I'm talking about artillery. I'm talking about electronic warfare. I'm talking about things like deception, the art of using camouflage to hide yourself from stuff in the air, netting, all sorts of things. This is something that was normal part of the toolkit during the Cold War. I believe that Western militaries largely have divested from this because they haven't had to worry about that kind of threat since the end of the Cold War. Now, suddenly, because we're dealing with the possibility that we won't have air superiority against somebody like the Russians, or now we've got the drones, now you have to worry about this kind of thing again. And then we have new capabilities that, again, we're seeing in Ukraine. Drones, of course, counter-drone technology, cyber, there are a whole bunch of others. You need these things now in order to fight war. If you're focusing on European defense, you need to take all of these things very seriously. Also, okay, so if we unpack them, the next, this idea of contributing meaningfully to a big coalition war, what does that actually require? Regrettably, it's not really clear what that requires, because it really depends. Like, do you need ground forces? And then you have to ask yourself, well, what kind of ground force could Britain send to, let's say, some big coalition war against Russia, given Britain's limited resources? Let's say Britain can generate a few brigades. How useful are those brigades going to be in the overall scheme of things? Maybe Britain should focus more on naval contributions. Maybe really the key thing Britain should do is focus on, let's say, locking down the Baltic Sea against Russian vessels, Russian submarines, or the Arctic Sea, or protecting the coast of Norway, something like that. So ground forces, maybe naval contributions, maybe air assets. Maybe the best thing Britain can do is simply provide aircraft, fighter jets, attack aircraft, maritime patrol aircraft, ISR aircraft, airlift, etc. There are all sorts of options here, and it's really far from being clear which of these, of all these things, what's the best way for Britain to contribute to a large coalition war. But either way, Britain wants to be able to contribute meaningfully to a large coalition war. So this is on the list of desired things. Then we have the question of the ability to deal with anything anywhere, because one never knows. This is a real challenge because it kind of runs contrary to the impulse to, or the imperative to, be able to defend Europe. What I mean by that is that if you want to focus exclusively on, let's say, defending the European continent from the Russians, I mean, that's already a large thing. That requires a lot of effort and a gigantic amount of money. But at least it clarifies matters in terms of the kinds of equipment you need, the kinds of capabilities you need, and you could tailor a force specifically for that. But the reality is that if you want a force that's multi-purpose, because you never really know where you're going to fight and when you're going to fight and what are you going to be doing, then it becomes risky to tailor a force for a very specific purpose. So you need a force that's not that tailored, that's more flexible, that's more multi-purpose. Again, it's always easier said than done. Now, it's generally true that forces designed for high intensity conventional warfare are more readily, they're more adaptable, and it's easier to convert them into a lighter force for a lower intensity conflict. But that being said, you're still going to need some sort of high-low mix. You're still going to need some sort of capabilities that are really geared towards the lower stuff, because I mean that's just sort of the way it works. But it's also it's in your interest. Again, if you want to preserve this ability to be flexible and to really be able to handle anything, think about 1982 when the British military, which was very much geared towards fighting the Cold War and playing certain roles in NATO and defending Germany, etc., found itself in the need to mount an expeditionary campaign to retake the Falkland Islands from Argentina. It was not easy for the British to do, simply because the British had divested themselves of certain capabilities that requires, while focusing on other capabilities that are more meant for this sort of its NATO role. So they had to scrape together stuff and they make do with the things that they had. They managed to pull it off, but it's different from if they had in 1982 a force that was already designed from the get-go to include more expeditionary capabilities, for example. Then there's the question of industrial capacity, and I think that this is really important. You need industrial capacity to sustain the fight, and this is something that we've clearly seen in Ukraine. Because the reality is, if you're fighting any kind of high-intensity war, you're going to lose stuff. You're going to lose tanks, you're going to lose men, you're going to lose equipment, plus you're going to fire large quantities of shells and missiles and your defense missiles. How do you stay in the fight? Well, in order to do this, you need industrial capacity. The reality is that, as far as I know, all of the Western defense industries don't really have much in the way of capacity. The reasons for this are really very obvious. Basically, after the Cold War, with all these countries seeking some sort of peace dividend, they shrank their forces, which means instead of having a fleet of, I don't know, maybe 1,500 tanks, now you're going to have, right now the British Army has about like 200, 210, 220 tanks. So if you're buying things in small numbers, that means that if, let's say you're the person who builds the tanks, you've got the tank assembly line. Instead of taking orders of hundreds of tanks, you're taking orders of maybe 100 tanks, but spaced over a 5-year term. So you're only building a certain number of tanks, small number of tanks per year. You're not going to just knock them out in a week. What you want to do, because after you've knocked them out in a week, then what are your workers going to do? You're going to lay them off, close the assembly line. You don't want to do that. So you build them really very slowly. So you make those that say you have to make 5, you make them very slowly over the course of the year. And as a result, just the defense industry is just not geared for scale. It's not, and it can scale up, but only with great difficulty and at great expense. And it's something that the British are looking at, and they're realizing, like, we don't have enough capacity. Now, of course, The problem with capacity is that in order to build into your defense industry, basically capacity you don't need, except for in case of emergencies, this runs counter to anything that you'll ever learn in a business school. Business schools these days are all about lean operations. They're all about, like Toyota, uh, what's it called? On-demand supply. Like, you just want enough parts to build the correct number of cars in the right amount of time, and you don't want to have extra parts sitting around because that's an inefficiency. You don't want any extra capacity. Defense industry, of course, is different. Actually, you need excess capacity, which is wasteful, but you have to accept the waste. It has to be wasteful, which means it has to be very expensive. How do you do this, and what's the cost of it? I think this is something that Western militaries are hotly debating and trying to figure out, like, how do you actually manage that? One way is just to order a lot more stuff. Instead of ordering 5 things a year, you order 500 things a year, and the defense contractors will do what they need to do in order to make that happen. That costs a lot of money. And then if you're going to have 500 of these things instead of 5, what do you do with them? It's complicated. It's expensive. So with all of this, then, the British, when they're looking at this, so you've got this list, everything from nuclear deterrence to having some sort of high-low mix, to being able to defend Europe against the Russians, to having some sort of global presence, to be able to have some sort of the ability to project forces, which means having expeditionary capabilities versus like big tank battles in Europe. All of these things are tensions. All of these things are competing for scarce dollars, or I guess in this case, scarce pounds sterling. So what do? Part of the problem, in addition to all this, is that there are always trade-offs that Western militaries make, and the British are certainly making. One of them is a trade-off between quality and quantity. Generally speaking, quality these days means high tech. That's really expensive. And because it's expensive, it means that you buy fewer of these things. So the tendency is to buy fewer items, but these are exquisite items. And there are trade-offs, and there's a question of whether or not it's better to have things that are less good but in greater number. But the reality is this is actually really hard to do. I mean, just imagine this. Let's say, you know, you're the Minister of Defense of Britain or any other country, and you say, all right, we have requirements for a new fighter plane. Now imagine the elevator pitch of like Lockheed Martin gets into the elevator with you and says, all right, great, we've got just the thing. We saw your requirements for a new fighter jet. We've got a plan, we've got a design, and the plane we're going to build for you is going to be good enough. All right? Like, that's good enough? What does that mean? I mean, who's going to go for that? Who's going to say, oh, we're going to, Lockheed Martin is offering a good plane that's good enough, whereas this other contractor is offering this plane that's going to be like awesome. And of course, the plane that's awesome, they're going to understate the cost because that's the way it always works. It always turns out to be more expensive because awesome, exquisite is extremely expensive. But it's hard to make the argument for buying something that's just good enough when what you really want is awesome. You want all of your requirements to be met and then some. And so, imagine the offer is like, well, we'll kind of meet your requirements. We'll meet them well enough. It's difficult to do. It also, another factor in this is the fact that we now have all volunteer militaries, which means they're smaller, so you've got less people to spare. It also means that politically it's, well, because you have fewer people to spare, you can't politically accept a lot of attrition. So a classic example of this is the old comparison of the German World War II battle tanks like the Tigers versus the humble Sherman tank. By all technical measures, the German tank was the Tigers and whatever. I don't really know my German tanks. There are all sorts of different types of Tigers. That's not really my thing. But by all technological measures, they're superior to the American German tank. They were these exquisite tanks. And of course, they're very expensive. They're hard to maintain. The Germans did not have the industrial capacity to make large numbers of them, even if they could afford it. Whereas with the Sherman, basically what the Americans did was the Americans sort of said the Sherman represented a good compromise. It was good enough. You're going to lose a lot of them because they're inferior to the German tanks, so a lot of tank crews will die. But we've got so many of them, and because they're cheap to make, easy to maintain, easy to replace, you can crank them out by the thousands. In the long run, this is the winning option. Now, these days, it's really hard to make that argument. Imagine if the U.S. Navy were to say, also, like, we're going to make frigates that are good enough, And we're going to accept that we're probably going to lose a few when we fight the Chinese. But we're not going to pack them with as many capabilities as we want. Or, maybe for the F-35s, we're not going to get the F-35s because it's not. We don't need that. We want something that's just good enough. It's just not the way these things work. There are also other tensions, though, in terms of trade-offs. You invest your money in modernizing your current capabilities, or just acquiring new capabilities. Britain has 200 something tanks. They're kind of outdated. So there's a program afoot to modernize the tanks, which is expensive. The money that you spend on modernizing tanks is money that you're not spending on acquiring. The British Army also needs more like rocket artillery. So where does the money go? Right? And if you're modernizing all this stuff, this is maybe money that's not available for buying more F-35s or buying more frigates or one of these things. Everything's a trade-off, right? Because there's a limited amount of money. And then, of course, we have the risk rewards of downsizing, the classic way that Western militaries have gone about trying to generate savings that they could then invest in things that they feel like they need to invest in is by cutting the size of things, cutting the size of the fleet of aircraft or the size of the ship fleet or the size of the army, right? You're going to go from 100,000 men to now, like the British have like 70,000 guys in their army. Fewer people is cheaper, but at some point you've got too little. How little can you get away with? At what point do you have too few things for them to be useful, for them to serve the kind of purpose that you want? The British also have to deal with what I call fixed expenses. So, classic examples: nuclear deterrence. This, for the British, this has become non-negotiable, but it's very expensive. These nuclear submarines and the missiles and everything, that's expensive. But that's you're putting that aside. You're not touching that. You also have naval carrier battle groups. Britain has, as I said, they've acquired these new carriers, and if you intend to use them, or at least one of them, because there's talk about one of them simply being on reserve and only being used while the other is going to be in dry dock or something like that. But to use one of them, this is very expensive, and it's like a sunk investment. The people, the equipment, the aircraft, the escort vessels that you need for these things to do their job, this becomes sort of like a fixed expense. I have to add to this in terms of fixed expenses, the British commitment to the F-35B. They've chosen that this is the one thing that they're going to do. This is how they're modernizing their Air Force, but also their naval aviation. It's very expensive. There are cheaper alternatives. There's risks associated with it, but it's expensive, and they're committed to buying a certain number of these things. And then I would say another fixed expense is the determination to maintain some kind of heavy ground warfare capability. We're talking tanks and armored warfare. It's optional; they don't have to do this, but this is something that Britain so far has decided that no, they're gonna keep it. It's reduced, but they want to maintain it. Again, there's an expense associated with this. This means, for instance, renovating the tanks, modernizing them. But this also means modernizing all the things that you need in order to use tanks effectively so that they're not massacred in terms of, you got to pair it with artillery, you got to pair it with this, that, the other. There's also the capabilities and units and also stuff that have to operate together with the tank. So it's expensive. Throughout a lot of this, I think that the British have been rightly debating about how few things can you get away with, how few ships can you get away with. Remember, you need a certain number of ships. You need ships to do all the things that you want your warships to do, but you also have to protect your carrier. You want to be able to protect force. You need to be able to protect the carrier. You need to be able to do anti-submarine warfare. You need to be able to keep British waters safe. There's all sorts of things, but if you only have a few ships, then you're handing them out in ones and twos, and there's a real danger that you just don't really have enough to go around. This is true for the Air Force. The size of the RAF is small. They only have a few aircraft. They're only buying a few aircraft. These new aircraft might be awesome, but there are only a few of them to go around, and they can't be everywhere at once. There's also the question of numbers. An F-35 maybe can take out a dozen Sukhois, right? But if it's an F-35 against 20, the F-35 loses. These things become trade-offs and becomes a real issue. So what do? So I want to make some general observations. So first of all, historically speaking, Britain, or perhaps I should say England more accurately, has done very well with having a relatively small army and a relatively large navy. It makes sense for an island nation that has always been dependent on trade. And it has only occasionally put ground forces on the European continent, and often in a way to try to alter balance of power. So they've got larger armies are fighting each other, and the British will show up and make a contribution that hopes to sort of tilt the scales, but not large enough that they're going to be the player. They've also done well simply by funding other people, by injecting gold or injecting other sort of resources to help one country against another. An example of this today might be what Britain's doing to support Ukraine by giving the Ukrainians a lot of weapons and also money. Arguably, this is a much better investment for Britain in terms of security and defense than its own military, right? So buying missiles and giving them to the Ukrainians gets you more than buying them for yourself. Now, ideally, you have both, and this is another dilemma that the British are having. The British have actually handed over so many weapons to the Ukrainians that arguably their own stocks are now depleted. Like they've given self-propelled howitzers to the Ukrainians. Do they have enough for themselves? They've given over javelins. All these things that they've handed over, they need to, from their own stocks. This is a good investment from a dollars and cents point of view or a return on investment point of view, but you need your own. Now, but arguably, maybe just buying more stuff for the Ukrainians, maybe that makes more sense than buying it for yourself. In terms of, let's say, the army relative to the RAF or to the Navy, again, having a large standing army actually has been the exception to the rule. Britain maintained one during the Cold War. They maintained something called the British Army of the Rhine. And it was this large, very capable force that sat in Germany, and it was there to help defend against the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact. Part of the thinking is that with the Soviets that close, because remember they were on the inter-German border, you had East Germany and West Germany, and that they were right there, that the fear was that a Soviet Warsaw Pact defense would roll over Western Europe so quickly that the French would quickly get knocked out. England, I mean, it would be like a repeat of 1940 all over again, and the British didn't want that to happen. So they reckoned that the best way to prevent that from happening and to slow the Soviets' advance would be to have this large army. Arguably, that's not a requirement anymore for a number of reasons. For one thing, the Russians are no longer on the inner German border, they're now all the way on the Polish Russian border. Also, Poland is emerging as a major military power and will soon be the largest land power, arguably, in Europe. Why do you need a BOAR, British Army of the Rhine, if the Poles are there? With the rise of Poland as a military power and also the integration of Finland and Sweden into NATO, again, the argument is that a significant deployment of British forces to the European continent is no longer as essential as it used to be. I mean, Finland is very capable militarily, spends a lot of money, and the Finns are, they've been fixated on fighting Russians since forever. They're a great ally to have. Sweden's military is small, it shrank, but they've radically increased their defense budget. They're acquiring more capabilities. Sweden is now on track to become a much more powerful country. And then the combination of Finland and Sweden, plus Norway is increasing its military capabilities. Again, how essential is it that Britain have a presence on the continent? Which begs the question of whether or not maybe the best way for Britain to support Europe and to support a large coalition warfare is less about ground forces and more about the Royal Navy and more about the Royal Air Force. That's where I would tend to go. I think ultimately because of Britain still sees itself as a world power. Britain still aspires to be able to do things on its own. Britain, or at least no, let me rephrase that. Britain still aspires to be able to make a difference. Also, the understanding that maybe these wars will end up being someplace else. The answer so far that the British seem to have drawn, and this is what I got from the Land Warfare Conference, is that there's this idea in the British military that somehow through different kinds of thinking and different approaches and technology, they can somehow double, what is the line, like double and then triple the war fighting power of the British military. And it's kind of an absurd idea because, first of all, what does that even mean? I don't really know. And so the idea is that somehow you can magically increase the capabilities of a force with the assumption that you're not actually going to increase the size of the force and you're not going to make major changes to the force. And the same British general who gave a speech on this subject argued that, or he made clear that the inventory of the British military is not going to change significantly overnight. It's not like they're going to double the number of tanks or replace those tanks, or whatever they've got is what they've got, and they're just replacing stuff kind of incrementally. But somehow they're going to be able to increase their warfighting value. I think this is a dangerous way of thinking about it because this idea that somehow magically, I mean, it's magical thinking ultimately, they can, instead of making these difficult decisions that I've been talking about here, they can abstain from making decisions by virtue of the fact that through this magic, they can double and then triple the warfighting abilities of the military, right? It seems like they're giving themselves an excuse from making difficult choices. And I increasingly think that after 20 years, 30 years of floundering, the time has finally come for the British to actually start making very hard choices. But of course, as I said, I empathize. These are very difficult choices to make. So if you like this video, please hit like and subscribe, and then stay tuned for the next video, which is going to focus much more on the British Army. Thank you.